Okay, so today we're diving into a really interesting topic, one that I know a lot of people have strong opinions about.
Oh, yeah, this one is definitely a conversation starter.
Exactly. We're talking about ADD, attention deficit disorder.
Right, and I think what makes this deep dive particularly fascinating is that we've got some material here that really challenges some of the common assumptions surrounding ADD. Kind of pushes us to think a bit deeper about, what's really going on.
Yeah, it really does. And it's interesting because when you hear people talking about ADD, especially like back in the 90s, there was a lot of skepticism around it. Our source even mentions some folks calling it like the flavor of the 90s, which I thought was kind of funny.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's a catchy phrase, but it points to something important, right? Like,
Mhm.
why was there so much skepticism then? And why does this debate continue even now? Is it just a trend, or are we talking about something more substantial?
Right. And I think part of the reason for the debate is that when you actually break down the characteristics associated with ADD, it can feel like, well, lots of people exhibit some of these traits to some degree, right? Like, who hasn't struggled with focusing or getting distracted sometimes? Our source even mentions this Harper's Magazine review that jokingly suggested, if we really wanted to, we could pathologize practically every aspect of human experience.
Yeah, that's a great point. It really makes you think about where we draw the line. Are we talking about a genuine neurophysiological or psychological condition, or are we just kind of slapping a label on normal human variation? And if it is a real condition, how do we make sure we're diagnosing it accurately and not over-pathologizing everyday behaviors?
That's a huge question, and it's hard to ignore the fact that there's been this huge increase in the number of ADD diagnoses and medication being prescribed.
Yeah.
I mean, our source points to a five-fold jump in Ritalin consumption in Canada between 1990 and 1997. And apparently, there were similar trends in the US.
Yeah, those numbers are pretty startling. And it definitely raises some serious questions, especially for parents, right?
Absolutely. Like, are we over medicating kids? Is this just a convenient way to explain away challenges that adults face, maybe as a way to avoid personal responsibility? These are tough questions that we need to grapple with.
For sure. And I think it's important to acknowledge that our source doesn't shy away from these questions. In fact, it dives right into them. It acknowledges that there are definitely neurophysiological and psychological components at play in what we call ADD.
But then it goes a step further and stresses that we can't just stop there. We need to be constantly questioning and refining our understanding of this thing, how we diagnose it, how we think about it, and how we approach treatment.
Exactly. And I think you hit on something really important there, the how we approach treatment part. Because let's be honest, it often feels like our society tends to jump to medication pretty quickly, doesn't it? Like instead of really examining the social and cultural factors that could be contributing to these issues, like stress, the pace of modern life, all that stuff, it's often just, okay, here's a pill.
It's like we're looking for a quick fix, right?
Yeah, and our source expresses a real concern about the long-term consequences of this approach, and not just for ADD, but for conditions like depression as well. We're just starting to understand the broader impact of this reliance on medication.
And then there's the whole issue of personal responsibility. Because some people will argue that these neurophysiological explanations are basically just excuses for bad behavior.
Right. And the source actually brings up a really disturbing case in British Columbia where ADD and OCD were used as part of a defense in a rape and murder trial. And it's significant that the jury ultimately rejected that argument.
It's a tough case because, on the one hand, we do need to hold people accountable for their actions. But on the other hand, shouldn't we also be trying to understand what leads people to engage in harmful behavior in the first place?
Absolutely. And the source suggests that maybe if we had a better understanding of those underlying factors, the experiences that shape people, it could lead to more effective ways of addressing things like crime and incarceration.
It's like instead of just punishing people, maybe we could be doing more to help them, right?
Exactly. And it's interesting, the source actually points out that a significant percentage of prison inmates are likely struggling with ADD or other self-regulation issues. And then, of course, the conditions within prisons often end up making those problems even worse.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle.
It is. And I think what the source is trying to get at here is that while understanding the biology of ADD can be helpful, it's not the whole story. It can give us a kind of map, as they put it, but it doesn't actually tell us how to navigate the journey. That's where personal responsibility comes in.
Okay, so let's shift gears for a minute and talk about parents. Because I know that for a lot of parents, the idea of their child being labeled with ADD can be really scary.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's this fear of stigma, of their child being seen as different or somehow less than.
Right, and I think that's a big part of why our source emphasizes how important it is to avoid turning the term ADD into a judgment.
Mhm.
It's not about saying that someone is ADD because that implies that the diagnosis is all they are, which just isn't true.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that kids with ADD might need different kinds of support.
Yeah.
More creative approaches to learning and thriving. It's about helping them reach their full potential, not limiting them with a label.
And it strikes me that this whole conversation about ADD also kind of reflects our general discomfort with the ambiguity of mental health diagnoses in
Oh,
general.
sure, sure. We like things to be black and white, right?
Hmm.
Healthy or unhealthy.
Yeah.
But what if it's not that simple? What if it's more of a spectrum?
That's what our source is suggesting, right? Like, maybe what we consider abnormal is really just a more concentrated version of brain processes that we all experience to some degree, which kind of leads to the unsettling thought that under enough stress, any of us could potentially, well, lose it a bit.
Mhm. Yeah, and that idea actually ties in nicely with the work of Hallowell and Rady, who are mentioned in our source. They propose that ADD is more like a dimension of human experience, not a black and white category. And it only becomes a diagnosable disorder when the characteristics associated with it start to significantly interfere with someone's ability to function effectively in their daily life.
So it's not just about having certain traits, it's about the extent to which they're causing problems. And speaking of definitions, our source makes a really interesting point about the word disorder itself.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Because when most people hear disorder, they think of it in the medical sense, like a disease or an illness.
But our source points out that there's this older, more general meaning of the word, which is simply a lack of order. And they argue that this definition actually fits ADD pretty well because it encompasses things like being disorganized, having trouble with planning and prioritizing, constantly losing track of stuff.
It's a much more descriptive way of thinking about it, isn't it?
Yeah, it feels more relatable somehow, and it kind of gets to the heart of what many people with ADD experience in their daily lives.
And it's important to note that our source is very clear that they don't view ADD as a medical illness in the traditional sense. They propose that it's more accurate to understand it as an impairment, kind of like having a visual impairment, even though your eyes are structurally fine. It's about a difference in function, not necessarily a disease process.
Okay, so then the obvious question is, where do these impairments come from? What causes them?
Well, that's where things get a bit tricky, because even with all the advances we've made in brain research, there's still no definitive answer to that question. And our source is very upfront about that.
But they do suggest that a good way to evaluate any explanation for ADD is to ask ourselves a few key questions. Like, does it make sense in light of people's actual experiences? Does it align with what the research tells us? And most importantly, does it offer any practical help to people who are struggling with these issues?
Those are great criteria. And it's interesting because this is where the perspective presented in our source really starts to diverge from a lot of the mainstream thinking about ADD.
Hmm.
You see, a lot of popular books, and even many professionals, primarily view ADD as a genetic disorder, something that's passed down through families.
Right, like it's all in your DNA.
Exactly. But our author isn't so convinced. They argue that while heredity might play some role, it's probably less significant than many people believe. And they suggest that we need to look beyond just DNA if we want to truly understand ADD.
It's about considering the whole person, right? Their experiences, their environment, and all of that.
Precisely. And the author feels very strongly that the impact of the environment on the development and expression of ADD is often overlooked.
So it's not nature versus nurture, it's nature and nurture, right?
Yes, they're intertwined. And the source makes a really important point that a lot of biological processes in the brain aren't just hardwired by our genes. They can be significantly influenced by our experiences throughout life.
And that brings up this key distinction between inherited predisposition versus genetic predetermination. Our source explains that a predisposition just means that something is more likely to happen, but it doesn't guarantee it. The actual outcome is shaped by tons of other factors.
And to illustrate this point, they mention a study from 1998 done in Sweden that found a surprisingly high prevalence of ADD in the prison population, which kind of suggests a link between difficulties with attention and self-regulation and ending up involved in the criminal justice system.
It makes you think about how individual vulnerabilities can interact with societal factors to produce certain outcomes, doesn't it?
It really does.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's safe to say that ADD is a lot more complex than just a simple label or a matter of willpower.
Absolutely. It's a multifaceted issue involving potential biological predispositions, the powerful influence of our environment, and the unique experiences of each individual.
And I think our deep dive today leaves us with a really important question to consider. Given this more nuanced understanding of ADD and recognizing the potential impact of environmental factors, what are the broader societal implications? How can we better support individuals who are facing these challenges? And how can we address the environmental factors that might be contributing to them?
Those are big questions, and I don't think there are any easy answers. But they're questions that we need to be asking ourselves as a society. Because ultimately, it's about recognizing the wide spectrum of human experience and understanding how our biology and our environment are constantly shaping each other.
And that's where we'll leave it for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll see you next time.